So my name is Elizabeth Velarde. I am coming from San Antonio, Texas. Um, and I have my background is primarily in the nonprofit sector. I've been in this space for the last 13 years now, since 2011. I've done work with after school programming through the Boys and Girls Club. I've also done work in child abuse prevention, college access, and I currently lead a nutrition education program here in San Antonio for an organization that serves 12 cities around the United States. And so, how we got here is kind of throughout my journey as a nonprofit professional. I realized that there weren't a lot of people who look like me in leadership spaces with decision making, abilities to really make an impact on the communities that we were serving, right? So there was that disconnect between who we were serving and who was leading these organizations serving these communities. And so I started to get an interest in um, how do we make that change happen? How do we bring more Latinas into these leadership pipelines, specifically in the nonprofit sector, being as that was the area that I have the most experience in? And so it was the focus of my dissertation. And so I completed my doctoral degree in August of 2023, so fairly recently. And so this research came about through that work. And so basically, I'm going to just kind of walk you through that research and kind of talk about the things that came up and what we can do with that information. If at any point you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Raise your hand, whatever works better for you. And I'm always happy to connect offline if this is something that you'd like some more information about. So, the objectives for today's session, we are going to identify opportunities for Latinas to move into leadership positions. We will identify barriers to leadership opportunities for Latinas and identify strategies for developing future Latina nonprofit leaders. So, the background of this research in particular, as women continue to navigate the labyrinth of challenges to entering leadership positions across sectors, Latinas have to contend with the additional complexities that are at the intersection of race and gender. And there's very limited research on the specific experiences of Latinas in nonprofit organizations. So as I was kind of diving into this work, I realized that most of the research that's been done has been on Latinas in education, Latinas in the corporate space, and there was very little that talked about Latinas working in nonprofit organizations. And we know that Latinas experience society differently from other women, but also from Latinos, right? And so I wanted to be very intentional about really centering their experiences. And so the overarching question for this dissertation was what can be learned about the leadership trajectories for Latina women in nonprofit organizations from women who have been successful leaders? And furthermore, how can this be used to help aspiring leaders also be successful? So I'll walk you through a little bit of the literature that is available. And so you can kind of see here what we know about Latinas in leadership in general. Is that Latinas do make up about 15% of the female workforce in the United States and about 7% of the total workforce. And we all know that there's a wage gap, right? A Latina would have to work 23 months or so, almost 2 years, to earn the same income that a white man earns in 12 months. And there is this feeling of needing to assimilate into the dominant culture to be seen as more professional, right? Toning down the way that we dress, the way that we speak, and really kind of assimilating into this more dominant culture in order for folks to take us serious, in order for folks to see us as professionals in these spaces. And so, as far as nonprofit leadership is concerned, right now there is kind kind of an uptick in the number of leaders, nonprofit leaders who are preparing to retire. And there is going to be a need for qualified talent to make up what is called the leadership deficit. And so succession planning is key. And succession planning is simply just thinking about who's going to take this leadership place next, right? And so organizations need to really start thinking about how are we going to fill these vacancies. And so, not surprisingly, women do make up the majority of the nonprofit workforce, but they're only 56% of leadership in organizations with budgets of less than $1 million. For organizations with budgets of more than $1 million, the women who are leading these organizations make up a smaller percentage than that. And what we also know is that people of color in general are more likely to leave an organization due to a lack of diversity and inclusiveness. So if we're not seeing it in these spaces, there's not a whole lot that's going to make us stay in those organizations. But we also know that it's very important for Latinos to be in these leadership spaces. As this population increases, they're going to make up a significant portion of the labor force. And Latinos possess the qualities that are sought out, right? We have a culture that emphasizes the we, which is contrary to the more individualistic nature of the American capitalist society. So we as Latinos are looking at how do my decisions and my actions affect those around me, not just myself, which is contrary to kind of what we see oftentimes in like corporate America, where it's really about how does this benefit me first. And so, like I mentioned, there is very little research that addresses the specific issue of Latina leadership within nonprofit organizations. But we do know that Latinas struggle in a white supremacy culture. They're passed over for promotions and they lack professional development opportunities. So that's what the research does tell us. And so, along with my dissertation, during my research, I was able to find less than a handful of other dissertations who were focused on looking into Latinas in nonprofit organizations, and they kind of focused their work in California. So we'll talk more about that. But to kind of frame how this dissertation research came about, the theoretical framework that I used was a combination of what we call Latino critical race theory, or LATCRIT. And you may have heard of critical race theory, which kind of talks about the way that people of color experience things differently from white people. And so Latino critical race theory expands on CRT to really take a closer look at the Latino experience of race in society. So we're talking about immigration status, language, and how those things affect the way that Latinos are experiencing race, right? And then because we were talking specifically about Latinas, the other framework that was used is Chicana feminist epistemology. And I know that that's a mouthful, but basically all it's saying is that Latinas their experiences differ from those of Latino males and other women. And so it provides a lens through which we view these social issues as they're experienced by Latinas. And so this work was done using narrative inquiry, specifically testimonios and pláticas. And so testimonios is really about storytelling. It's really about sharing experiences through the art of storytelling. And this comes from Latin studies and the telling of stories to bring to light the oppression of people in Latin American countries. So it's something that our community is very familiar with doing. It's really sharing their experiences through their stories. And plática really comes from this cultural practice of knowledge sharing through conversation. So, sitting at the table with, your café con pan and really just kind of having a conversation. And so really what this work aimed to do was to really make it a space where these women could tell their story, feel comfortable, gather in a space that's familiar to them, and really be able to just share their stories. So through this work, I was able to conversate with 12 different Latinas. Of course, these are pseudonyms, but each one was able to give me their testimonial about their experiences as a leader in the nonprofit space. And so once all 12 of these interviews were conducted, I also set up a group Platica, and the names that you see with an asterisk are the women who were also participated in that Platica with me. So you can kind of see here where everyone came from. So this work did center in Texas. And so they came from Dallas, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, Laredo. So kind of a range of geography as far as where everyone was coming from. So they either worked or lived in these spaces. And so once all of the conversations were done, the data was analyzed, there were 8 major themes that came up. And so what you'll see in the next few slides is those themes. And so the major themes are in green, and then the bullets are sub-themes that are included in that one major theme. And the ones that you see highlighted in this like salmon color are associated with the quote that you see on the right. And so one of the biggest themes was the influence of culture and how culture influences the way that women navigate these spaces, right? And so one of the participants stated that she had to learn to be a chameleon, right? So just trying to become what people want of you when you're in this position of leadership, and really being able to kind of adjust and really modify. And that kind of goes back to that idea of assimilation. Another major theme was that leadership should reflect the community, right? So the people that we're serving should be able to see themselves in the leadership of these organizations that they are entrusting with whatever need it is that they have. And so one of our participants, talked about how the leaders in an organization that she worked with prior to becoming a leader herself, they were all white women, a few white men. And then when it came to the actual program implementation, so that direct work, that frontline work, that's where you had a lot of Latinos, people who spoke Spanish, who were able to kind of work with the community more directly. And so there was that disconnect between those folks serving the community directly and those leading the organization. And then we talk specifically about what makes a successful leader, right? In the eyes of these women, how were they able to be a successful leader? And so we talked about how they defined leadership, the leadership skills that they felt were important, and what aspects of their personality made them a good leader. And so again, this is the same respondent from the previous one, kind of talking about how we define leadership, and realizing that the folks that are doing that frontline work, we're not including them in the conversation. We're not bringing them into the room and making space for them to also be in a position to make decisions, to become leaders, to grow within these organizations. And then another big piece was, how are we taking care of ourselves, right? As Latinas, as leaders, we have to be able to find those ways to remove ourselves from the work, and be able to take care of our needs, our needs for self-care, our needs for rest, but also being able to advocate for ourselves within these professional spaces. And so, for a lot of these women, this was a hard concept to kind of verbalize because oftentimes as Latinas, we are also tasked with being the caregivers, the nurturers. When the kids get sick, who is it that typically has to take care of that? When our parents fall sick, who is typically the ones handling that, right? It's usually the daughters. And so, kind of navigating these two different worlds and all of these different expectations is something that was kind of evident in these conversations. And so, one of the participants talked about um, needing to put things in place that would allow her to take care of herself because she knew that if she was taking care of herself, she wasn't going to get lost in the work. And she needed that balance, knowing that burnout is really high in the nonprofit sector. She needed to have that more intentional approach to her self care. And then across the board, one of the biggest themes that came up was this idea that relationships matter, that you need to have someone in your corner who is willing to advocate for you, who is willing to open a door for you, who is willing to bring you into these spaces. And so several of the participants talked about being the person that can bring other Latinas up with them, that can open the door, that can, there were a lot of metaphors that were used, opening the door for others, making sure that that ladder was there. Once you've climbed the ladder, making sure that others can do it as well. But really being intentional about this idea of providing that support for upcoming Latina leaders, right? Like not just making it, but also making it and finding ways to help others make it as well and supporting other Latinas in those spaces. We also talked about challenges and how working in a space that is primarily white dominated could be a challenge, and how they navigated those things. So one of one of the participants talked specifically about how working in this predominant white culture, sometimes you feel crazy, right? Because others aren't seeing the things that you see. Others aren't experiencing things the way that you experience them, or understanding why, when someone says something that could be seen as a microaggression or as having some sort of racial undertone. But there's also this challenge of, being that token Latina, right? Wanting to, um, you know, check the diversity box, and that bringing about feelings of imposter syndrome, right? Am I here because I deserve to be here, or am I here because I'm checking a box? And then we also talked about these ideas of femininity, right? And what does a leader look like? And is that idea of a leader aligned with, the way that Latinas look, right? We come in all shapes and sizes, all different shades. And so oftentimes that does not align with the beauty standards that we have in America. And so kind of navigating that as well, right? Like understanding that it's okay to, be yourself in these spaces and still be able to be seen as a professional. Um, and so these were all things that for these women were challenges. They were things that they had to navigate on a daily basis. And then finally, we talked specifically about navigating these systems, right? We talked about the educational system, and we talked about just navigating these professional spaces in general. And one participant talked about it as basically navigating a whole new culture, right? It's understanding how to be yourself within this other space. And so this participant talked about how she utilizes her culture and her upbringing to kind of navigate that, right? And so the way that she deals with people is very much based in her culture, dignity, respect, listening to others, las conversaciones, creating that relationship. And so it often goes against kind of the way that we're taught to navigate these spaces, or the way that to be a professional. Often the Latino culture conflicts with that, and so being able to remain authentic in your true self while also navigating these spaces, and really just kind of learning to lead in the best way that makes sense for you as a Latina, as a leader in these spaces. And so, if we bring it back to the original research question, right? What are the experiences? What are the barriers? And how do we prepare aspiring leaders? One of the major experiences is how do we keep our Latinidad while learning to navigate these white dominant spaces? And I think that's something that continues to be an issue, will continue to be an issue until we have more Latinas in these leadership spaces, in the leadership pipeline, to be able to start to change some of those things in order to move the status quo into something that is more reflective of our communities. And as far as barriers, these leaders had to overcome barriers that were both cultural and professional, right? So it was navigating this professional space as a Latina, as a leader, but then also kind of living in this professional space, and it oftentimes conflicting with the Latino culture as well, right? It's not often encouraged for Latinas to pursue and aspire for these big promotions and these big jobs and big roles, because there are other responsibilities that our culture tells us that we should be taking care of. And that's hard to navigate sometimes. And when we think about preparing aspiring leaders, what we're talking about is that education and professional spaces are best suited for preparing future nonprofit Latina leaders. Um, you know, Along with being a nonprofit professional, I'm also a parent. And so I've worked with, my daughter's high school, and kind of talking to students about what I do, the work that I do as a nonprofit professional. And one of the questions that I've gotten several times from these kids is, what is a nonprofit? What does that mean? And so it really starts as early as possible. If we want to get more young girls interested in this work, and not only young Latinas, but just people of color in general. It really is about exposure. It really is about putting that information out there and showing um, these future leaders that there is a career path here, that there are ways that we can give back to our community, but also, become a leader, do well in this work. And so, and then once Latinas enter these professional spaces, we have to make sure that we have the supports in place to keep them in these organizations, but also to help them grow within these organizations. And so one of the things that I will mention, and I kind of touched on it throughout, is that this research was limited to Texas. And so there is more research needed to learn more about the experiences of Latinas in other parts of the country, right? We know that Texas is unique in its own way. And so I'm very interested in knowing kind of what the experiences of Latina leaders in other parts of the country look like, where they differ and where they're similar. And it also just so happened that most of the participants came from urban areas or large cities. And so there is more research that's needed to identify differences for Latinas working in rural communities. because we know that that's a whole other area as well. And so, as a result of this research, some of the recommendations that came from it that I'm hoping to kind of expand on moving forward um, is we should be creating relationships with colleges and universities to provide learning opportunities for Latina students. So things like experiential learning, internships, bringing these students into these spaces to kind of get them familiar and knowing more about this work as early as possible, right, before they've entered those professional spaces. But once they have entered those spaces, establishing leadership success and succession training programs internally. Oftentimes, and I've seen this happen personally in my own professional career, oftentimes leaders are brought in from the outside. We're not hiring from within when it comes to these more senior roles. And I think that that provides a space where entry level, middle management staff are feeling like, I'm good enough to do the work that I'm doing now, but I'm not good enough to lead. I'm not good enough to, move up within this organization. And that will cause folks to leave. That will cause them to decide this is not the place for me because I don't see any growth here. I don't see any opportunities to move up in this organization. And so if we can start to think about how are we setting ourselves up for succession planning now and looking at our entry level staff and training them, providing them opportunities for development when those more leadership opportunities come up, we have a well prepared workforce right within our own organization, and we don't have to always look externally to fill these roles. And many times nonprofits do have the ability to be flexible with their employees, with their staff. And so sometimes it's as simple as negotiating a work schedule. If we have a Latina who also has those responsibilities as a parent, as a spouse, as a daughter, as a whatever, you know, just saying, hey, if you need to come in at 8:30, great. That's fine, to get the kids dropped off at school or just being flexible with maybe hybrid work, remote work, whatever the case might be. Um, but when we have that lack of flexibility is when we're also losing um, uh, talent that with just those simple adjustments could be an easy fix. We also want to set hiring goals, right, to increase the number of Latina applicants. If we are intentional, again, not just checking a box, but knowing the value that Latinas bring both culturally and professionally into these organizations, being intentional about, who we're hiring and how we're setting those goals. And again, when Latinas are coming into these spaces as entry level staff, partner them with senior staff. Let them see kind of firsthand what is the work that is going on there and how, what they're doing today translates into what they could be doing in the future. And then another recommendation is including Latino history as part of DEI training for staff. I think a lot of times we tend to focus on more broad kind of DEI initiatives, but in spaces, especially like here in Texas, where we have a very large Latino community, just knowing kind of the background of the Latino community can really help others to know kind of how to navigate just conversations, interactions with Latino colleagues, and just kind of understanding why. We might have a colleague that likes to hug, and it's not that they are trying to be unprofessional or anything like that. That's just culturally, right? And so just kind of thinking about what comes next, right? So this work is for me just kind of step one, really kind of identifying what are some of these initial kind of thoughts and ideas behind um, Latina leadership development, specifically in the nonprofit sector. And so one of the things that I am currently working on is developing opportunities, professional development opportunities that focus on this, right? And focus on those more entry level, middle management areas. There's a lot of leadership development already in place for those folks who are already in leadership. But where we're lacking, I think, a little bit is in those professional development opportunities for folks who are just starting out, who are maybe kind of testing the waters and trying to figure out if the nonprofit space is where they want to be. And I think if we can nurture and grow those folks, we're more likely to have that talent stay within these organizations and really be able to develop a good group of quality talent for this leadership pipeline. And so I would encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn, kind of stay tuned for things that are coming as far as some of these professional development opportunities. And if you're interested in specifically the dissertation that I've been referencing throughout this presentation, the title of that dissertation is Historias de Liderazgo, Understanding the Experiences of Latina Nonprofit Leaders Through Testimonios en Plática. I know that that's a very long title, but you can find that work and really dive into the rich conversations that came from this research. And there's hours and hours of just conversation and storytelling that came from this research that's included in this dissertation and that I do plan to share moving forward.